I've spoke about this issue in the past, but today I wanted to talk about why the alt-right love the Crusades in general, why they love the First Crusade specifically in a lot of instances, and I kind of wanted to use this video to debunk a lot of the claims they often make when talking about the Crusades. And also as an ex-Catholic, I know that Catholics a lot of the time spread these myths about the Crusade too. But before we go any further, if you want to support my content, which is largely demonetized, including this video, please check out my Patreon. Any amount that you give to me is hugely appreciated. Also check out all my social medias and my podcast in the description. Now, if you weren't aware, Deus Vult is an alt-right meme. It's mainly when they're talking about Islam and Islamic terrorism and just more, Muslim refugees coming to Europe. So you get stuff like this. I can put it on screen now. So it's a crusader saying we need this, so we don't have this, and it's a protest about people in the UK wanting Sharia law, and of course that does exist. And then here's another one. It is Donald Trump, Putin, and Pepe the Frog riding horses, and their faces are photoshopped over crusaders, talking about the crusade to reclaim Germany and talking about an army to defeat Caliph Merkel. Probably talking about things like, the Cologne stuff that happened a couple of years ago where they all went hysterical, and it's mainly obviously racist memes talking about stuff like white genocide and the Great Replacement. Now I want to get into what the alt-right think the Crusades were and what, a lot of Catholics, like I mentioned, also think it was. A lot of people think the Crusades were a defense against Islam. So why this is so wrong on so many accounts is that it paints both sides as monoliths. So you had Islam versus Christianity, and that is not a way to discuss history, to discuss the conflicts around these two religions. So also what they like to do is paint the Crusade as a total response to continued Islamic aggression since Muhammad's death. And obviously when Muhammad died, shortly after, Islam split into two factions, mainly the Sunni, who thought you should follow, the priestly class, and the Shiites, who believed Muhammad's bloodline should be in charge. And that's just a brief version of it, so you already have two groups, but then you have a lot of the Sunni Arabs taking over North Africa, and in 711 they cross the Strait of Gibraltar and they move into Iberia, taking it over and establishing their own caliphate. Now, what they also do is try and expand into France as well, but the Arab armies there are beaten at the Battle of Tours. Now the Battle of Tours is in 732 AD, and it sort of cemented the balance of power in the region where Spain and Portugal were mostly dominated by Arab Muslim caliphates, and the Franks and other Christian groups occupied the rest of Europe. And in other instances, Arab Sunni Muslims would also invade Italy and Sicily and set up caliphates there, but it didn't really expand much further than that, and that's between 700 and 800 AD. Now of course there were wars, there were battles between Christian kingdoms and Muslim kingdoms, but it wasn't a continued push into Europe. It sort of began to subside and these territories just existed. And it's kind of ironic to think that Christians are responding to Islamic expansion that basically stopped going inwards into France in 732 when they called the First Crusade in 1095. So just to get into a bit of history before we sort of debunk the monolith sort of argument. So in 1095, upon a request from Emperor Alexios I of the Byzantine Empire, Pope Urban II was seriously considering sending him knights because that's what he asked for. He said the Seljuk Turks, a bunch of Asians who'd come down from the steppe lands in China and converted to Islam, were at the gates of Constantinople. They were taking a lot of Byzantine territory. He asked for Christian knights to help repel the Seljuk Turks from really taking over the rest of his territory. Pope Urban II saw this as an opportunity to not only reunite the Eastern Church with the Western Church through an act of good faith with the Orthodox Christians, he also saw it as an opportunity to take back the Holy Lands, including Jerusalem. So you have two crusades going over in the First Crusade. You have the People's Crusade, which is made up of like peasants and mercenaries who go through Europe killing any Jew they can find because they blamed Jews for killing Jesus Christ, just a nice bit of anti-Semitism in the First Crusade, before getting to Constantinople and eventually being sent over to Asia Minor to get slaughtered by the Seljuk Turks because the Greeks had had enough of them really destroying land around Constantinople. Then you have the proper First Crusade, led by various European knights and European royalty. Of course, a lot of them actually didn't want to go. So the kings in France and in Europe and in England, they didn't really fancy it. So a lot of them were just aristocrats and knights who saw an opportunity to really make a kingdom for themselves in the Holy Land. And of course, they were motivated by religion, but you'll see with the outcome, a lot of them weren't. They were motivated by monetary gain and territory. But it's funny, the First Crusade has always been painted as an unequivocal defense against Islamic expansion, which had relatively stopped. But the Crusaders also attacked the Greek Christians when they got to Constantinople. They actually laid siege to the city. So if this is some great defense of Christianity, why aren't they working closer together? Why are they fighting each other? And that really goes to the point of the myth that Christianity was not unified. There was no notion of the West. Most of the countries we have today didn't even exist. It was just little fiefdoms, kingdoms, some, countries like England starting to emerge as we know them today, but they were all fighting each other. For years and years they were fighting each other. And because a lot of them were quite religious, they felt bad and they thought they were all going to hell for killing each other for so long, because they'd been killing their fellow Christians for decades and decades. But the Pope said, if you go on this crusade, you will get a pass from me where you will go to purgatory instead of hell, and eventually you'll go to heaven. But to go more into the monolith argument, when these Christian armies passed into Asia Minor, they were first fighting the Seljuk Turks, but then they were fighting various Arab Sunni warlords before fighting Shiite Muslims who controlled Jerusalem, who had their allegiances to the Fatimid Empire from Cairo. So that is multiple different Islamic groups who also have been fighting each other for hundreds of years. They're not really concerned about spreading their religion all over Europe. They're more concerned with territory and their own empires, because their attention has really diverted from maybe what they used to want to do and spread this religion. They just care about their power. And numerous Arab warlord groups actually allied themselves with the Crusaders. Again, this was not really a war between Islam and Christianity. It wasn't this clash of ideologies. It wasn't Christianity and all the good Christians stood up to the Muslims and finally repelled them. No, it was just an expansion by the Vatican. So eventually the Knights took over Asia Minor, took over all this territory, and what did they do? Split it into separate kingdoms. There was this guy called Bohemond from Sicily. He didn't even bother going to Jerusalem. He just set up his own kingdom in the first bit of territory he took over. And when the Christians did eventually take over Jerusalem, it became the Kingdom of Jerusalem and its own little territory. And just like I was saying before, the Christians would fight each other, the Arabs would fight each other as well. There was no monolith of Islam versus Christianity. The Crusaders, who did make a sort of tenuous alliance, didn't stay allies for long once they actually got there and just had a scramble for territory. So the whole myth about the First Crusade by the right wing and by the far right is just based on people who don't understand nuance in history. And I guess people asking, what expertise do you have on this? And I did a history degree, and I did the First Crusade, and I've read multiple books on the Templars and all the Crusades, so I have a fairly good knowledge of it. And I'm just going to say that this was not a response to Islamic aggression, as they always like to say. This wasn't a defense of Christendom. Christendom wasn't threatened by and large because these Christian kingdoms were pretty militarily powerful, while just like the Christian kingdoms being split themselves, the Arabs and various other Muslim groups like the Turks, like the Fatimids, like the Persians, they all didn't like each other. They were all fighting each other just as much as the Christians were fighting each other. Now, just like how people don't understand history, I feel maybe some people like to lump the Crusades all in together. So when they're talking about the First Crusade and maybe Islam being a monolith, maybe they're taking Saladin and how he united the Muslim Arabs against the Christians to kick them out of Jerusalem, and then obviously King Richard the Lionheart led the English against him. But it's really not indicative of the wider cultural rivalry, religious rivalry at the time. And like I said, it's far too simplistic and just flat out wrong, because Pope Urban didn't one day think, damn, I'm being threatened by Islam, better call a crusade to defend Christendom. That's not what happened. He seized an opportunity where the Seljuk Turks were threatening Eastern Christians, who a lot of Christians in the West didn't care about because the first thing they did when they met them was start to kill them. He just used it to expand the Vatican's power in the Middle East. So I hope that debunks the whole notion that the First Crusade was somehow a justifiable reaction against Islamic aggression. And I feel like a lot of our politics today really play into that viewpoint, of especially with people like George Bush calling the war on terror a crusade, and a lot of people in the West, I've talked about this before with, atheism and Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilisations, where they like to paint it as Islam is a monolith versus the West in the 21st century, just like they like to paint the Christians and the Muslims, where both are very, very simplified and, in my opinion, very, very wrong representations of how the world works. But it's something that's gained prominence. Muslims are uncivilized barbarians who just want to take over everywhere, and now with the alt-right saying white genocide and cultural genocide by Muslim refugees is the same thing as what they were doing, in 700 AD, and the only appropriate response is to take some sort of violent action against them. And in neoconservatives' view, back in the day, it was to bring civilization and democracy to those barbaric Muslim countries. Now, Time did a good article debunking this as well. I really used my own knowledge to start this video, but they got some good examples I just want to highlight here. So it talks about, other crusades. So for a start, medieval crusades were by no means exclusively fought against Muslims. One of the busiest regions of crusading was in fact the Baltic, where for centuries armies wearing crusader crosses fought against pagans in modern Poland, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. In the south of France, there was a crusade in the 13th century against the heretics known as the Cathars, and that one is particularly brutal. I would read about that because it's actually pretty shocking and disgusting. So in 1204, during the ill-fated Fourth Crusade, a French and Venetian fleet disgorged an army which laid siege to Constantinople, slaughtering and robbing Greek Christians and burning hundreds of acres of the greatest city in Eastern Christendom to the ground. And after the papacy of Innocent III, popes began to use the crusade as a blunt political instrument against their allies, launching crusades against Christian rulers up to and including Holy Roman emperors, supposedly the secular defenders of Christendom in the West. And just to expand on what I was saying earlier, where the first Crusaders would often ally with Arabs. So in 1244, one of the most important battles of the entire Crusading period was fought between the Sultan of Egypt and an alliance of Crusader knights and Islamic forces from the cities of Homs, Aleppo and Karak. So the Christians by and large in the whole Crusading period didn't really have a problem with allying with Arab armies and with Muslims when they needed to or when it would benefit them. So as I've outlined throughout the video, the alt-right completely get this wrong. They get the whole Crusading period wrong and they get the First Crusade wrong. This crusade was not a response to Islamic aggression in the short term because there wasn't much Islamic aggression threatening the whole of Christendom in the way people like to paint the Battle of Tours as this decisive victory that protected Western Europe from, the aggression of the Islamic empires. And it's clear it was just a political move by the papacy at the time. And it's also clear there was no unity in the Muslim camp and they were happy to fight each other and they were happy to ally with the Crusaders when they could use them against their local rivals. So whatever further the original disciples of Muhammad had in spreading this religion was long gone about 300 years after. But for the alt-right, the simplicity in which they view this period, in which they view the First Crusade, or the Crusades in general, is helpful to their cause. So then they can show people this revisionist history and say, look at the time when Christians rose up in Europe and said no more to the threat of Islam, to the constant expansion of Islam. They said no more. They took up the cross. They went to Jerusalem. They took it back from the Muslims and they defended their homes from this religion which is so incompatible with Western values, with Christian values. And they did what was necessary, just like we should do now when we see refugee crises, which see some of the poorest Muslim peoples in the world flee to Europe in the hopes of a better life after they have probably been forced out by either Western intervention or a dictator who has been historically backed by the West. But then we thought maybe we'd topple them and create such awful conditions in their country where they have no choice but to flee. And in particular, I'm obviously thinking of Libya and Syria, and you can find multiple pictures of Tony Blair shaking hands with both Gaddafi and Assad. And just one more note on why the alt-right love the Crusades. These conflicts were insanely brutal. They're actually pretty well documented as well. Even the First Crusade is surprisingly well documented for something that happened 900 years ago. You can read about the sacking of Jerusalem by the First Crusaders. It's awful. They spared no one, and they described how they spared no one. They described the smell, they described the blood in the streets and the bodies. They described that in detail. So it's obviously pretty sickening that anyone would glorify such a thing. And I guess it's not surprising why certain groups like the alt-right glorify it. But I've had multiple conversations with Christians and with Catholics who also thought the Crusades were justifiable, and a lot of them also thought they were good. Now, it's obviously pretty sickening when you read about it firsthand. It's obviously a super fascinating period in terms of a cultural exchange between these Christians from Western Europe and these Arabs, these Turks and these Persians. But at the same time, it's just awful religious sectarian violence that you'd hope would stay in the past, but thanks to neoconservatives, thanks to people like George Bush, thanks to the alt-right, thanks to this constant fear-mongering about Muslims, and I feel new atheism has a massive role to play in radicalising young white men against the Islamic world, then this simplistic mindset of civilization versus Islam, of West versus Islam, of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilisations becomes very appealing and a very appealing way to view the world. And Three Arrows actually has a way more detailed video about this, so I'd go watch that. And let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Please like the video, maybe share. Please check out my Patreon and my social media links in the description if you just want to type them in, at the Kavernacle on all social medias, mainly Twitter. Check out my Reddit, which is r/theCavernacle for my subreddit, u/TommyCahill1995 for my personal Reddit. I'm also on TikTok now, and I was pretty hesitant to make this, but please check that out as well. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.